Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first day, the full day of the third Global Piano Roll meeting. I welcome you to the Conservatorium very warmly, and my name is Neil Perez da Costa. I'm Associate Dean of Research here at the Con, and I've also been working with the team who Kumaran will introduce to you in a little while. It's our custom these days in Australia to make an acknowledgement of the country that we are on. This is unceded lands of Aboriginal peoples, and we're on Gadigal country here in this part of Sydney, which stretches to the harbour and goes a fair way east and a little bit west as well. There are literally thousands of Aboriginal lands in Australia. We say unceded because they were never given over when the British arrived. It was taken from them, and we acknowledge them now because we are on this fabulous land. This conservatorium is pretty much on lands where boys were initiated with music and dance ceremonies, and down the road, down in the botanical gardens as well, there was a lot of music and dance that happened for millennia. And with Aboriginal cultures, song is incredibly important in terms of disseminating knowledge. Everything is through song, also language. And again, there are literally thousands of different Aboriginal languages across Australia. So I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay tribute to their elders, past, present, and to emerge. And we feel so lucky to work here in this beautiful building. This was designed not so long ago, about 20 plus years. Before that, the conservatorium was literally the old part, which some of you saw last night in the Verbruggen Hall. And the Verbruggen Hall, in that bit that looks like a castle, we call it the castle here, was actually the stables of Government House, which is just through the gates there in the Botanic Gardens. So the horses were all fed and watered in the middle there where we now do concerts. And I believe that if you go down into the bottom of the Verbruggen Hall, you can still smell the hay and the horses down there. The smell is still lingering. So welcome to the building. It's a big building. You're free to walk around and have a look. We've got some great courtyards. Back that way, we face into the Botanic Gardens. There's some great views. It's quite a warren of rooms in here. And we're in the West Recital Hall. There's an identical hall just next door, and we use this for small concerts, lectures, and all sorts of other activities, chamber music, etc. Just a few housekeeping things. The toilets are literally out the door and left. There's a set of toilets up there, but there are toilets also around the building. We do have a room which will be open shortly if you have something you'd like to display. It's room 1046, but we'll put a notice up and you can put things in there. It's safe for the next 3 days. It'll just be for us. And finally, people have asked about going onto the internet. We do have guest Wi-Fi here in the building. My colleague, Anthony Schmiel, will have a QR code ready on the table out there, which you can click onto. It just requires you to put an email address in, probably mine or Anthony's, and then your details. If you click on that, we can connect you to the Wi-Fi. And I'm not going to say anything more. I hope that you enjoy being here for the next 3 days, and also for explore the area around here. There's the Botanic Gardens, there's the harbour very close by, and just across on the left over here is part of the oldest part of Sydney, which is called the Rocks area. And if you want to explore, it's really amazing and leads to some beautiful gardens and parks called Barangaroo, which is probably the latest development in Sydney with lots of extraordinary buildings and areas to look around. So please enjoy the time that you have here, and I'll pass over to Kumaran.
Thank you, Neil. Oh, okay. Okay, can you hear me? That's good. So welcome all again. Thank you to Neil and to Peter, who have been our hosts here, who will be our hosts for the next 3 days. And it has been an enormous undertaking to host such an event. It always is, and you can see that on Peter's face. But it will go well, and it always will, and we're all here to enjoy our time together. So it's definitely a biggest gratitude of thanks goes to Neil and Peter, and as well others on the ground here, Glenn and others who have been helping to organize and put this all together. It's a considerable effort, so we should all thank them. As well, I wanted to thank the organizing committee for the Global Piano Roll meeting. which includes a couple of people who are not here, Martin Skamlitz and Daniel Allenbach from Bern, who have been, despite the fact that they weren't going to travel here, extensively involved with organizing and continuing to be a part of this whole effort abroad and with the website and so many things, so many logistics. So I really must thank them as well as Mark Viduk, Tamar Barzel, and Sebastian Bausch, who also has been a part of the committee that has helped this all happen. And finally, I also should thank all of you for attending. This, I think, is a sign of some change for us. First of all, we've made it all the way over here across many ponds to Australia, and that we know is a considerable effort and considerable resources for all of you, and I think we greatly appreciate that, to have the in-person meeting, but also we know that it is a sign, I think, of something that is being grown here, that is being developed, that it matters to all of us to be here together and to continue this work in person, even in such a place as far away as it is, as beautiful as it is. So thanks to all of you for coming, for sure. And we know there are many others who will be also witnessing and seeing the events after the fact on the online lectures that we'll have who are in spirit with us today as well. So I just wanted to quickly say it's been 10 years actually since I've been to Sydney, and it's a very auspicious 10 years because it was the occasion on which Stanford University acquired the Dennis Condon collection, and it kickstarted our whole effort with Rolls. And really at that point, Peter was our host. It was a somber moment perhaps for some of you all here in Australia, seeing the collection leave, but also knowing that hopefully there was some new effort that would be undertaking. And I couldn't have imagined at that point that it would be what we have at this point, and including not only just at Stanford, we have 5 of us here from Stanford, but as well from around the world, and with this collective effort that has now been undertaken. So it's inspiring and wonderful to see all this work. And we have much more to do. So we are here today with this conference to continue all of the speculation, all of our work towards understanding what these artifacts are, the rolls, the instruments, all of the different types, the formats, as well what information they can give to us, what we can learn from them in terms of both performance practice, as well just culture, history, and even the nuances of this incredible technology, this incredible industry, this business that was formed around this artifact. And then as well, what we can do to preserve them and to make it accessible to the public going forward in the future. So we have talks on archival processing and preservation, paper conservation, as well as what we've been doing, digitization and online access to rolls, which is a very big part of this effort too. So it's very exciting to hear all this. I hope you are as well. And I will stop here and we will begin our first session, appropriately enough, with Australian rolls, Australian collectors, and what they can teach us, and this wonderful industry which we'll learn more about that is in our presence, that was in our presence here in this country. So with that, I will just introduce pretty much the moderators to each session, which are going to be, for this session, Peter, who regaled us last night with his wonderful concert as well. I should just add that. It was a wonderful opening event, and we'll have more to come as well tomorrow. So anyway, thank you, Peter, and thank you to all. I'll leave it to Peter to take us through.
Well, our first program today is, as we mentioned, Australian presenters, Australian music roll companies. And our first speaker is Ray Edmondson. Now, Ray has a very significant history in this. We have in this country what's called the National Film and Sound Archives, which, as the name says, it archives sound, film and piano rolls. Ray was a foundation member of this organisation, which he retired some time ago, but he still retains all his interest. And he was a wonderful supporter of Mastertouch. There was a time when Mastertouch wanted to close, and Ray and another colleague were prepared to actually buy the company and to keep it going. That didn't happen, unfortunately, but nonetheless, It shows the spirit that Ray brings to this. So without further commentary other than to say welcome Ray, thank you, I'd welcome Ray Edmondson to our first speaker.
Well, thank you, Peter. My paper is called A Tale of Three Cities. The cities are Sydney, Canberra and Stanford in California. For decades, the core of Australia's piano roll heritage lay within two adjoining Sydney suburbs, the factory of the Mastertouch company in Petersham and Dennis Condon's private collection of rolls and instruments in Newtown. Mastertouch closed in 2005 and Dennis Condon died in 2012. That heritage is now widely dispersed. It is at least partially lost to public access and consciousness. This paper refers to three institutions: the Stanford University Library, the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, and the National Film and Sound Archive in Canberra. The Condon collection is now at Stanford. The Mastertouch factory and equipment and instrument collection are now at the Powerhouse, and the Mastertouch archive of some 12,000 rolls, previously at the National Film and Sound Archive, is now dispersed. In the 1970s, as enthusiasts sought a secure place in Australia's cultural life for this aspect of our musical creativity and social evolution, the vision of a mechanical musical museum to maintain the means and skills of roll production emerged. Why didn't it work out? And can it still be put right? In this paper, I'm talking about the pedal-driven player piano or pianola, not the more elaborate reproducing piano. The pianola is an interactive medium. The player or the operator controls the expression, the pressure on the pedals and the speed of roll travel. In the early 20th century, given the high ownership levels of domestic pianos, Australians had an active home entertainment life and could be accomplished musically. Such skills were part of a primary classroom teacher's qualifications. I have seen figures asserting that Australia had the highest per capita home ownership of pianos in the world. I don't know whether that's true or not. Player pianos were imported from Europe and America and manufactured locally here by the Beale Company in Sydney. Piano rolls were sold in the same shops as gramophone records and sheet music. Popular hits of the day appeared in all three formats. For example, the pop song for the 1929 Australian feature film, The Adorable Outcast, was available as sheet music, so you could play it yourself on your piano, or as a Mastertouch roll, or as a parlophone record. Goulburn and Miss Dutton would gladly have sold you all three. Like books, you could even rent or exchange rolls for commercial libraries for a few pence. Piano roll recording and manufacture in Australia began with Len Luscombe's Broadway in 1917 in Melbourne, and George Horton's Mastertouch, originally named The Duo, in Sydney in 1919. They were joined in 1923 by a short-lived subsidiary of the American QRS company that was manufacturing in Sydney. And like other stars of the entertainment industries, recording pianists like Len Luscombe and the Party Sisters were celebrities in their day. Decline began with the 1930s depression as sound films and especially radio opened up other entertainment options. The progressive introduction of television in Australia from 1956 onwards was particularly devastating as people traded in their pianolas to buy television sets. After Len Luscombe died in 1956, George Horton acquired his Broadway company, but slumping sales caused Horton to cease roll production in 1961. At that point, Mastertouch was acquired by one of his recording artists, Barclay Wright, who eventually set up his factory and piano restoration workshop in Petersham. He revived sales and secured new recording artists, and he's second from right in the top photo with his staff in 1975. That year, the National Library in Canberra was establishing a sound recording archive led by Peter Burgess, who's on the right in the bottom picture. Recognising the importance of the medium in Australia's musical life, the library acquired 2 copies of every new Mastertouch and Broadway release. It was also a gesture of support for the financially vulnerable company. Barclay Wright developed a collection of antique pianos and mechanical musical instruments, and attracted a network of supporters aware of the unique repository of skills and machinery that Mastertouch represented. They included the Powerhouse Museum, for which Mastertouch provided restoration work. The idea of a permanent working museum gradually evolved. This support coalesced in 1983 around a new non-profit body called Music Roll Australia, also known as Friends of Mastertouch. Peter Burgess and I were among its founders. It was designed as an entity which could potentially take over and run the Mastertouch as a public working museum, should that need arise. As a non-profit body, it could seek government subsidy and philanthropy in a way that Barclay Wright, as a sole commercial trader, never could. In March 1984, the government created the National Film and Sound Archive, or NFSA, by detaching the film and sound collections from the National Library to form the basis of a new institution. The library's piano roll collection became part of the NFSA, headquartered in the Heritage Building of the former Australian Institute of Anatomy, which is a Canberra landmark. The government mandated an advisory committee to plan the future of the new institution. Its visionary report in November 1985, called Time in Our Hands, included a recommendation that the NFSA develop a corporate mechanism to take over and maintain the assets, operations and skills of the Mastertouch company as part of the national sound heritage, and added that immediate action should be taken to ensure the continued viability of Mastertouch until appropriate long-term arrangements can be made. Now, this project particularly engaged the enthusiasm of Arts Minister Barry Cohen, who had presided over the creation of the NFSA. He saw it as a unique and distinguishing feature of the new institution. The operating production plant could be a visitor attraction in the NFSA's headquarters. Barry visited Mastertouch and met the staff, and he instructed the NFSA to proceed with an urgent fact-finding study as a basis for further action. During 1986, a detail consultancy was undertaken by Pete Marwick and Mitchell. This included making a complete inventory of Mastertouch's assets, an assessment of the future economics of roll production, and sketching out how the production line could be configured as a working museum on public display within the NFSA building. People drawn in for consultation included Dennis Condon and Francis Davis, who was the curator of musical instruments at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, or at the Powerhouse as it now is. As you can see, it was designed so that visitors could stand and watch the perforating, stenciling and rolling up process. In the course of the NFSA negotiations with Mastertouch, it made a 60-minute video of the recording and production process as it made its reference. And here we see the perforating in operation. Following the consultant study, the National Trust classified the roll production machinery for its rarity and international scope. But soon afterwards, Barry Cohen lost his ministry in July 1987, and his friend. His political successor did not share his enthusiasm for Mastertouch. Person has that. Yeah. His successor did not share his enthusiasm for Mastertouch. And the times are not propitious. Funding for public institutions like the NFSA were getting tighter. Here's a view of the stenciling process. An alternative scenario emerged by which the NFSA would acquire the Mastertouch plant but leave it in situ in Petersham, leasing it to Music Roll Australia, which in turn would develop it as a non-profit operating museum. The NFSA purchased some Mastertouch assets, such as the company archive of an estimated $8,000, with which some of the NFSA's existing holdings were then mixed. Much later, in 1999, the NFSA gifted the roll collection as a then stood to NRA. Seen in retrospect, the NFSA was still evolving. Over. Right, yeah. I'll just pause it there, okay. Seen in retrospect, the NFSA was still evolving as a young and unique institution for which there were no standard templates. It had inherited film and sound preservation backlogs which were well beyond its resources. Staff members familiar with films and audio recordings had little knowledge of piano rolls, and as discussions with Mastertouch and MRA dragged on, internal politics eclipsed curatorial objectivity and even became antithetical to the piano roll medium itself. This one's a bit quieter.
Doesn't matter. Okay.
In the meantime, it was also realised that there were developing aspects of Mastertouch which the NFSA's mandate as a public institution couldn't easily accommodate. When manufacturers stopped supplying traditional two-piece roll boxes, Barclay Wright set up his own facility to make them and to become a new profit centre catering for the market for quality boxes. The results were elegant and spectacular. Of course, this increased the price of the rolls themselves. In the United States, QRS used cheap die-cut roll boxes assembled by folding. As its director once told me, you don't play the box. But to Barclay, tradition and aesthetic experience mattered. However, by July 2004, Mastertouch was in crisis. Unable to pay creditors and verging on closure, MRA stepped in. Under a lease agreement with Barclay, MRA took on financing and management of the operation as a step towards ultimate ownership, while Barclay became general manager. It began the process of changing a private business into a public museum, reducing staff and unsustainable activities to stem trading losses. But it was a bridge too far. The culture could not change. At its AGM in May 2005, the well-qualified MRA board was voted out and replaced with current and past Mastertouch employees who hoped support handouts could somehow continue. Mastertouch manufactured its last rolls 6 weeks later on the 30th of June 2005. The Mastertouch building, the old Petersham fire station, was sold to help pay off debts. The roll production plant and the instrument collection was acquired by the Powerhouse Museum. The company's roll archive finally moved to the NFSA in Canberra, where it would remain stored on pallets for the next 15 years. Then, when Dennis Condon died in 2012, his collection of over 7,500 rolls and a diversity of grand upright cabinet players was acquired by the Stanford University Libraries in California. Yes, it was a significant loss to Australia. The picture on the left shows Dennis as the music teacher at Fort Street High School in the 1950s. That's when I met him. I was one of his students. I don't know whether other Australian institutions tried to keep his collection in the country. In response to a recent parliamentary question, the NFSA said it decided not to purchase the collection due to the cost and an assessment of the international nature of much of the content. If only the excellent work since done by Stanford University could have been replicated in Australia. By 2021, the NFSA, like other national memory institutions, was on hard times. By attrition, it had lost expertise, curatorial and corporate memory. It decided to dispose of the palletised Mastertouch collection. In my role as NFSA's by then Curator Emeritus, I counselled caution and consultation with experts. After extracting a selection of rolls from the collection, the NFSA announced the disposal of the remainder by tender. Backed by the Australian Collectors of Mechanical Musical Instruments, or ACME, concerned former NFSA staff and board members, myself included, urged that the whole collection be kept, offering their voluntary expertise and efforts to accession the collection into the NFSA database. In July 2021, I wrote an article for Inside Story, later republished in the newsletter of the Australian Music Trust, citing the situation of the roll collection as emblematic of the larger issue of the NFSA's loss of expertise and memory. But the disposal proceeded. The NFSA CEO explained that for legal reasons, the successful tenderers must remain unidentified, though each had undertaken to preserve, digitise and provide access to the rolls. She declared this to be a positive outcome that will generate interest in piano rolls for new audiences into the future. I'm advised that the NFSA sold 3,630 Australian rolls as a single lot to one private individual in Australia, and the remaining 4,530 duplicate and international rolls were divided into 13 lots and awarded to various organisations and individuals within Australia. The NFSA currently has a Beale pianola in operating order, as well as a Duo Art that is not in operating order. There are 371 accession rolls in the collection and about 1,000 more rolls waiting accessioning. The Working Museum scheme and the preservation of the collection was right in principle, but every circumstance worked against it. For the NFSA, it was too big a leap for an immature institution grappling with other problems. The years of generational change and skills depletion while the collection sat on pallets in the NFSA meant that by 2021 institutional memory had been lost. MRA would have been able to take a more flexible approach to the Working Museum concept, but when it was finally tried at the last minute, it legally required Barclay Wright to cede ultimate control of his life's work and vision to a non-profit company. After so many years of struggle, it was something he couldn't do. As part of the sound heritage of Australia, piano rolls should be accessible. We can't change the past. What can we do now? Primary initiative, I think, now lies with the Powerhouse Museum, custodians of the production plant, and surviving master rolls. Is the Working Museum concept still a possibility? Could we perhaps even see today's hits being punched out on the Mastertouch perforator again? The historic output of Broadway and Mastertouch is well documented through published rollographies and catalogues. To the extent that these rolls survive, now scattered among institutions and private collections, could a consolidated directory of holdings be assembled and maintained online? Is this a possible coordinating task for the NFSA or the Powerhouse or ACME? The fact that we are gathered here suggests that there is a future for the heritage. Whoops. Anyway, sorry, that's the end. Thank you.
Questions for Ray over what is really a significant thing here that happened in Australia, to suddenly have all these roles in an archive situation be sent to people we don't know. It's a secrecy thing, and I'm personally quite upset by this, to think that these roles go to people we never heard. Oh, sorry, I need to... Right, sorry. I'll try and repeat what I just said. The story here, I think, is, well, it's very sad. We had a wonderful two companies which resolved into one, and when that company folded, I was there at that particular meeting, and I was very, very sad to see that the plans that were made by the MRA did not go ahead. Part of the problem, as I understand, was that Barclay was quite ill. His sister was there, and she actually, I think, was one of those that might have swayed the desire to shut it all down. We were lucky, however, that the Treasurer of the government at the time, Andrew Rafshawgi, actually paid to have the museum take the equipment. A huge cost, and that was all, fortunately, that was saved, and I'm sure Natalie will tell us more about that. So what we have at the moment is all these rolls dispersed amongst mysterious collectors. And it's very sad because there's some incredible recordings on these rolls. It's our history, and it's gone, and it's quite sad. However, I think Ray's got that message across. So are there any questions you'd like to ask of Ray?
Look, I just want to make one comment. I mean, ACME put in a tender for those rolls, and we never received a reply. So the whole tender process was corrupt. And, I mean, I don't know whether we should think about, well, I certainly, I think I will, complain to the federal ICAC. But there is no way that that tender process could stand up if examined.
Well, I was an observer from the outside this time. I was no longer working at the NFSA. I'm inclined to agree with you. From what I observed, I was very unhappy with the way it was dealt with. I think it was unprofessional. We did put a group together. We put in a submission, and our submission was misinterpreted as a tender.
And you were threatened?
And I was threatened not to say anything nasty about the NFSA. Yeah, it was not done the way it should have been done at all. And the result is, I think, as Peter said, extremely sad for this country. Now, those roles are out there somewhere. The complete output of Mastertouch is out there somewhere. We just don't know where it is any longer. You could well put in a complaint to the Commission. Why not? However, that's the situation as it now is. I should say, because my association with the NFSA, I retired in 2001. We're now more than 20 years later. I have the honorary role of Curator Emeritus, which means I'm there to answer questions if I'm asked. What has happened, particularly in the last 10 years, if not longer, until the government changed here 2 years ago, all of the national collecting institutions went through an attrition period. The budgets were cut. Expert staff just left, retired, or went on redundancies, and so the corporate memory just disappeared. The NFSA's corporate memory, because it's a unique institution, is particularly vulnerable to memory loss. And by the time all this happened, it was way past any connection with the original acquisition. So nobody quite knew what to do with it, I think. They needed to clean house, so to speak. No, they could have gone about it much better than that, but yeah, so what more can I say?
Ray, can I just say that in the early 60s, when I was about 5 years old, Mastertouch actually had a factory and a shop front store in Canberra Road in Sydney. Yep. And I remember it had black and white tiles and lots of grand pianos and lots of rolls all around the walls. And it's a very nice memory. But I did work for a utility back in a government utility back in the 70s, and I remember seeing correspondence from Barclay about trying to get Mastertouch registered as a charity, and in that sense they could get sort of reductions on charges and things like that. And unfortunately, that, as far as I know, never eventuated either. So the poor guy, when he said he was sick, probably financial stress, and just caught up with him.
Barclay was always a sole trader. He was not a registered company. He tried to get government assistance, and sometimes he did. But as a sole trader, he's a commercial operator. Governments can't just give him money. And that was his problem. And so with MRA, we tried to find ways of indirectly helping him to keep going. It was, for a long time, it was essentially an uncommercial operation. He just contrived to somehow keep it going. I remember one staff member, I think, being paid in piano rolls.
Also, using it, they started manufacturing boxes, packaging, other things too that weren't related to rolls to sort of.
I think he saw the box making as a profit-making operation to support the roll production. I'm not sure it ever was a profit-making operation, and I think Barker needed the business acumen of the sort of board that we have with MRA, but he was his own man, operating in his own way, and so that was both a plus and a minus. He had a great vision for what he wanted to do, and he was very remarkably inventive in getting material for he went to New South Wales Government Railways when, I don't know if anybody remembers, railway tickets being printed on this sort of pink cardboard. Well, he got all the stocks, I think, for next to nothing, and used that for his roll boxes. He did this sort of thing, you know, but you can't keep going forever in that way.
Neil.
Yes, I just thought I'd make a bit of comment because I'm representing this university around the question of why an Australian university didn't purchase the Dennis Condon collection and the instruments. And I mean, when Stanford came forward with that plan, we did actually go into action as much as we could, but it was a short period of time. And as you can imagine, the amounts of funds that we need to raise can't be done without philanthropic support. Couldn't come from the university itself. The other problem is that I've been working here since 2005, and I know that these types of things, which are extraordinarily important, have to have a recognised educational value in order for the university to spend money on it. We can use it for research. But I had my book coming out in 2012, which talks about the importance of piano rolls. But really, people here didn't know. They weren't looking at the rolls in terms of their value for what it could do to expand our ideas around performance, and that's kind of what we're doing right now. It might be good to know that it's this first year that our piano unit actually got all the students to play on this instrument and to have lectures on rolls and early recordings and things like that, and we're in 2024. So this is building in Australia. I don't know about the ANU. They might have been able to do it, but it was the cost and the housing also. You need to have facilities that can do it. Stanford has the great thing about universities are that they collaborate with each other. So whether it's left Australia or not, that is sad, but it is a really wonderful world-class institution, housed beautifully, and we share the information. So I think that needs to be said about the sadness part.
If I can just say one thing in regard to rolls leaving Australia. Before the Condon collection left Australia, I archived every one of them. Many of the rolls you heard last night were from that collection. So it left Australia in its physical form. It remains here in its digital form. So are there any more questions for Ray?
Just briefly to follow.
Yes.
Two things. One is this is not just a history lesson, you might say, but one that is actively, I think, a problem for other museums, and for example, the Bradford Museum as well is going through, I think, a similar thing. Joyce talking, or you can represent that. So I have a question just about, well, we have to generally reflect on the lessons learned from this and what needs to be done to address such issues going forward with other collections, for one thing. And I suppose that'll be a conversation we had over the course of this conference as well. But on top of that, I think it also raises all the other topics that you've said, the educational value to communicate the value of roles, to be able to then make the case for them and have a longer memory as well. And then as well, the digitization and preservation and access. So that would have been another solution to the role problem. If it had been digitized, if it had been in some form coded or preserved in some way, that might have been another backstop for the problems that were created. But it's just a comment, I suppose, but we'll have this conversation, I suppose, in the remaining days.
Yes, that had always occurred to me why the NFSA did not digitise the rolls before they dispersed them to wherever. However, that's all past history now, and I think we need to move on. But thank you, Ray. Our next presenter is Glenn Amer. You're going to see a lot of Glenn Amer this particular convention. Here he is with his hat on as a presenter. You will see him with other hats on later. Glenn is one of the few people, in fact he's the only person, well I suppose I know a couple of people who have cut piano rolls. But Glenn also has recorded his art on cylinder. He has an incredible library of music out there in the internet on Sony, and he was also a remarkable musician. He made piano rolls for Mastertouch. He did this as a young man, And here today, he's come with us to show his story. We'll hear some of his music. And look, can I just invite Glenn Amer? And I shall just get up his...
Thank you, Dr. Phillips.
Just find you.
I nearly bought a new Homburg, but I decided to save my money. I've had many Humbers. Thank you, Dr. Phillips.
Lean forward.
Yes, that's very... Now, you must excuse my croaky voice. I've too many international flights, too many flights over the last month, and too many concerts without a day off have destroyed my otherwise mellifluous voice. This is purely a personal reflection of my time at Mastertouch. And as you can see, I only found this very recently where they described me as the brilliant young Glenn Amer. I didn't know about that until I was the old Glenn Amer. Right, there we go. So, the first few years of roles at Mastertouch were actually issued under the Duo label, and the Duo label was used from 1919 to 1923. It was later changed to Mastertouch, and that was the name used from 1923 to 2005. I am assured by Barclay that was to avoid confusion with the possibly more well-known and expensive Duo Art roles. The name Mastertouch had its own complications, as I can remember people phoning the factory asking what sort of massage services we provided. Mastertouch was a division of Columbia Writing Products. J.H. Horton's company specialised in pencils and carbon paper and that sort of stuff. And it was a division of that until it was purchased by the following gentleman, Barclay Wright. 1934 to 2013. Barclay, as you've heard, owned Mastertouch from 1961 to 2005. And as we know, he donated the collection of instruments, perforating machines and ephemera to the Powerhouse Museum after his passing. I'd like to point out at this juncture that it wasn't all doom and gloom financially at Mastertouch. Barclay told me that they were running the factory in 3 shifts a day. It was running 24 hours a day to produce rolls in the 1960s. And at that stage, they were selling 5,000 rolls per week. Here's a photograph of me at the Powerhouse. Natalie, you should recognise this. That is me holding the master roll of my recording of the Grieg Nocturne Opus 54 No. 4. This master roll is now held at the Powerhouse Museum, and you can see the pin feed holes on the sides of the master. The recording piano that we all used, and you'll see that in action soon, had been modified to be able to play back these wider than normal master rolls. It could also play standard 88-note rolls, and I spent many happy hours listening to the archive recordings that were available to me. I'm always asked how were the rolls made. Well, in the following 16mm film clip that was made for a television program, Letty Keys, and that was her real name, is using the same recording piano that we all used right up until 2005. But in this recording, the recording piano is wired directly to the master roll cutting machine located adjacent to the piano. Let's have a listen. Now, Letty Keys' style became quite sort of staid, and there was a sort of a Melbourne-Sydney rivalry because Broadway rolls were really much, I have to say, they were much better arrangements. So there was a lot of, what would we say, rivalry between the two companies. Here's Letty.
Behind the front showroom is the factory, and there in a glass-panelled room rather grandiosely called the studio, Miss Letty Keys has been sitting down every Monday and Friday since 1920 to record the latest tunes for Mastertouch. the factory where a team of experts coach and cajole a battery of ancient machines into life. There, 16 rolls at a time, such tunes as the Anniversary Waltz, Jealousy, My Kentucky Home, Pennies from Heaven are still being churned out along with modern ones, like the Dean Martin Songbook and even Beatles numbers.
Any prizes for guessing what Letty was playing? I know you all know If You Rule Me, My Rosemary. That previous footage was taken at the Canterbury Road Mastertouch factory. In the following film, pianist Ray Hill is seen recording at the Petersham factory, which was the old church, and now it's a church again, actually. And this Petersham factory was where I made all of my recordings, in the same studio with the same equipment. Only by the 1990s, there had been the addition of MIDI and computer technology.
Faded away, but didn't die. In Australia, it's making a comeback with a modern beat. In a studio in the Sydney suburb of Petersham, a sound of the 70s is being recorded for the pianola by Ray Hill. She's resident artist for the Mastertouch Piano Roll Company, which has been producing music rolls without a break since 1919. The company claims to be the only one of its kind left in the Southern Hemisphere, and having survived the lean times, is now experiencing a growing demand generated by the nostalgia boom. Australian piano rolls were made on brown wrapping paper by pianist Len Luskin, a child prodigy who was conductor of the Majestic Theatre Orchestra in Melbourne when he was only 18. And in the 20s and 30s, Letty Keys and duo pianists Edith and Laurel Pardee firmly established what became widely known in the music world as pianola style. The pianola-style notes from this keyboard are relayed through an electronic memory bank to a recording machine that makes the perforated master roll. The music roll industry today stays in tune with the pop charts, even though much of the machinery used to make copies of the rolls is almost 70 years old. Up to 16 copies can be made at one time.
By the time I came to make my recordings, I only tried once to play directly from the recording piano that you just saw and have the roll cut onto that master perforator. It was a complete nightmare because the contacts that had been installed under the recording piano keys were so sloppy by that stage that you'd play one note and 3 notes around it would be recorded. So I spent all my time editing out the wrong notes. Believe me, I didn't play them in. I never played one wrong note. And you know, last night, it's quite well known that in that Chopin thirds G-sharp minor thing, we know that Rosenthal only played the bottom note and they added the other one in. Now, the next slide will be a pianola, a cutaway. I had been fascinated by player pianos since I was a child and had seen this particular cutaway illustration in the 1920s Cyclopedia of Knowledge that we had at home. My parents had bought the best possible Kawai piano for my piano practice when I was a child, so how could I possibly tell them that I would have preferred an old 1920s player? I therefore befriended an old-school player technician, the late Frank Salisbury, who very conveniently had his player repair shop just a few kilometres from my house. I would visit Frank every day after school and pedal roll after roll. Mastertouch had just then reissued the duo art roll of the Percy Grainger performance and transcription of The Waltz of the Flowers as an 88-note roll, and this was my favourite recording. The intricate harmonic language and marvellous rapid-fire scales used to enthrall me, and indeed they still did when we heard it last night at Dr. Peter Phillips and Professor Neil's recital. I used to apologise to Frank profusely for annoying him almost every day, But he and his wife always made me very welcome, and I think Frank appreciated the saturation tests that I used to give his repaired player mechanisms. Eventually, Frank taught me how to recover the 88 pneumatics on my Goulburn cut-up pianola that I had acquired, but I found the repetitive work tedious and the stench of the hot glue nauseating, and preferred to play pianos rather than to repair them. When I was about 17, I wrote a letter to the Mastertouch Piano Roll Company explaining that I was a student at this very institution here, the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. I was still fascinated by player roll technology, and if they had any time, I would dearly love to see the recording equipment. I jokingly said that I was also available should they require a recording artist. My letter was written on an old Royal manual typewriter, and I've always found that a sure way of gathering attention if you want attention, and I still use a typewriter to this day for the very same purpose. A return letter was received asking me to visit the factory at my earliest convenience, and when could I start recording for them. They hadn't heard me. They couldn't look you up on YouTube back then. Well, I soon made my first recording, a 2-roll potpourri of my arrangement of the popular tunes from Puccini's 1900 opera Tosca. The 2-roll set was seen as rather exclusive, and it was a unique selling point. It was decided that I would be the classical music specialist, as Greg Crease was the popular recording artist on staff. Greg also taught me how to edit the recordings. The popularity of the Tosca set led to rolls of the music of Erik Satie, Johann Strauss, Edvard Grieg, etc., etc. As I said, my rolls were not made directly into the cutting machine. There's a photo I'll show you later of the recording piano, which was by then connected to a cut-down Roland keyboard. The keyboard was thrown away and they just used the MIDI part of it. If they had have left the keyboard, it probably would have been a lot easier. I would now like to play my teenage self playing the ending of that Pearl Fisher's duet recording. Now, it must be noted that this was recorded on a 1920s Beale pianola that had been converted to the recording piano we have seen in the previous two 16mm films. It was then recorded via the MIDI box that I described, the Roland keyboard, into an early PC running Voyetra MIDI recording software. This was then converted by a special program Mastertouch had made to an on-screen editor where extra notes could be added by clicking and dragging a mouse, and the wrong notes from the recording piano would also be removed. This was the way that I added my sort of third-hand sound to my rolls. The reason I like player piano technology is because it can play things that we can't. The contacts that had been installed under the keys were exceptionally sensitive, and all the brush notes that were so sensitively recorded on the old piano could be edited out. The other main part of the editing was to extend notes to their duration in perforation chains, and this is what Ampico did in their rolls as well. A crotchet, or a quarter note, was an 8-hole chain of perforations. A quaver, or eighth note, was 4 notes, 4 holes, etc., etc. This was done because Barclay didn't want to rely on the old sustain pedals on the pianolas, because Barclay was convinced that these just did not work properly. And he was probably right, considering that many of the pianolas that would have played these rolls were still in original condition and had never been restored. The completed file was then sent to the master cutting machine, the one in the films that is cutting directly from Letty's and Ray's playing. Dr. Peter Phillips then used his second incarnation of his roll reader, to read the roll back into a MIDI file. This is reverse engineering in the extreme. And to make it just a little more palatable for today's audience, we've added some expression to it as well. So it's not just a belt-out 88-note roll. Now, Peter, I'm going to start the film, and I'm happy to say that I can still play like that after all these years too. This is the studio at Petersham, as I remember it, with the old recording piano and the Roland module, which you can see on the top of the piano. It was connected via cables at the back, and then that went into the PC recording machine. Seen in this photo standing, Greg Crease, the popular recording man, he made more rolls than anybody. He was quite prolific. And at the piano is a ragtime specialist, the late John Gill. The back piano, which you can just see behind Greg, is a piano quarter, and it had a complete library of tapes. And I really spent more time listening to that than ever doing any recordings. I was like a child in a candy shop at that place. I only made one popular music roll, although I wanted to make many, many more. The roll was the Patsy Cline song, Crazy. The reason I didn't make more is that it just took too much time on the antiquated recording equipment to fully edit the rolls to what I wanted them to sound like. That Pearlfishers took 3 weeks of editing, and you only heard the last minute and a half. I only realised how much time I had spent editing the rolls after Mastertouch had closed down when I started making recordings on my Yamaha Disclavia at home. What used to take days and weeks of editing in the factory, I can now record in less than an hour with multi-track recordings using this technology. We will see this in action in the final clip of my presentation today. Dear Barclay also thought my popular style was too flowery, which of course it was, and still is. There's a photo inside the factory. I think we've seen that photo already. I'd just like to end with a few of my memories of my time at Mastertouch. It really was like a magical step back in time for me, a person who loves early recording technologies, and as Peter said, I've also made acoustically recorded cylinders for the Vulcan Cylinder Phonograph Company when I was last in England, and lots of other antique recording technologies. I remember with great fondness the coterie of characters that worked there. Some of us will remember Doug Drummond with his planes and his Bentley, and of course Doug and I got on very well as I drove a Triumph sports car as a teenager. Judith, and I don't remember her last name, but Judith was in the office and she ran the place. Adrian Jorgensen, who perforated my rolls. That's him there. Greg Crease, who happily taught me all the secrets of the roll recording business. And of course, dear Barclay, who allowed a completely unknown teenager to make his first commercially released recordings. I only realised many years later that I was the youngest professional pianist in the history of commercially recorded music to cut 88-note rolls. I always enjoyed the daily morning and afternoon teas, which were, of course, served in fine bone china. We all wore ties, not at that stage, Adrian never wore a tie, and it really was like a step back in time. The brass on all the machines was polished at 4 p.m. every Friday afternoon. Many people wonder why I would listen to or even enjoy listening to a piano play itself. Indeed, I tend not to listen to the sort of music that I can play. I prefer music especially composed or arranged for the self-playing piano, particularly the music of Paul Hindemith, Alfredo Casella, and I have recently befriended some composers in the United States who have been very generous in sending me MIDI files of their own music, especially composed for Disclavia, particularly the composers Carl Gann and Paul D. Learman. I had the distinction of releasing the very first piano roll in Australia after the closure of Mastertouch. It only took an hour to record my 8-handed version of my arrangement of Mozart's Rondo alla Turca. It made me realise that the recordings could have been much more efficiently executed if we had better quality recording instruments at the factory. But the recording piano had been in use since day one, and it was how it always had been and how it always would be. The MIDI file, after I finished editing it, was sent to Julian Dyer to be perforated in London and sent back to me here. I trust you'll have found something of interest in my presentation. As Peter mentioned, I will be conducting the Joseph Hoffman Chopin Piano Concerto on Saturday, And I'll also be introducing instruments, if I have my voice back, on Sunday at Fairground Follies, where you'll get to see a Mills Violano and other instruments. There's a photo player there and a lot of fascinating instruments that we'll be able to demonstrate to you. So I would like to finish now with a very brief extract played on Peter's Weber Duo Art as an 88-note roll of my Rondo alla Turca. My Steinway that you saw in the previous clip has long since been sold to another collector. I might just say, thank you. I'd gone to do a concert when I was 17 or 18 somewhere, and the man comparing the concert said, I used to be able to play the piano like Glenn can play the piano, but I had to put a roll in it and pump it. And that was ironically the day I made my very first piano roll recording. I believe there might be time for a few brief questions.
Well, what about that? This man is probably one of the most incredible musicians I know, and here you've heard him making his own roll, plus rolls back in the 90s. Are there any questions for Glenn? And there probably are.
Oh, I've covered everything.
Yes.
There's no questions.
Yeah. Glenn and I share a very special relationship because of our mutual love of the rolls. Glenn has been incredibly supportive of some of my activities, which we'll see later in this conference. So, look, we're actually nearly at morning tea time. So unless there's any questions for Glenn? Yes?
I was just curious about making acoustic recordings. You mentioned that you've also done some of that. And how do you find that it actually, you have to differ the way that you play in order to record all of that?
Yes. The recordings I made in London, in Sheffield, were done exactly as they were done over 100 years ago at the Edison factory. And I was singing, you wouldn't know it from my voice today, but I was singing and playing at the same time. And we found that if there was one horn gathering my voice and one horn gathering the piano, that the voice vibrations would just run down to the piano horn and be lost. So we ended up using one horn only. And on an acoustic recording, there's no electricity involved. The vibrations that are being picked up in the horn are being carved into a wax cylinder. And I had to pound the life out of that piano just to make it audible. Of course, the voice was easy. That voice is recorded much better on acoustic processes anyhow. But yes, really the only difference I had to do was bash the piano to death.
And he's not normally a basher, I can tell you. Okay, well, it's nearly time for our morning tea. So if there's any more questions for Glenn?
I should just point out that Glenn is a very competent organist as well. He didn't mention that.
No. And a very good baritone.
Oh, come on.
Juan, you had a quick question.
Yeah, I just do you know from what year his master started recording the balls into MIDI files, into electronic files?
1990.
1990.
1990.
Okay, so are those electronic files available somewhere?
Until recently, I still had the discs, and in another divorce and another house move, I lost my floppy disks of my rolls. But Peter reverse engined them into MIDI files anyhow. I don't know. I think the John Gill stuff is still available. Tony Hilton might have those.
No, I have them.
Oh, you have them?
Yeah, and I can assure you they're a mess. As we've said before, the recording piano recorded 3 notes when you played one.
You wouldn't play them?
It's impossible to actually get them into a...
Where did those work with the masters for the raw production?
Well, after copious hours of editing, they became the masters, but the raw files that we recorded, which would have been saved on the disc, would not be usable until you spent weeks editing them. So even though they might still exist at the powerhouse, they're useless. And also the proprietary software that Mastertouch had made to edit them on the screen would, you'd be lucky to be able to run it now. We were talking 186 computers.
Well, Greg Creased always called it the steam-operated computer. Anyway, look, we've run out of time.
Talk to me if you want to ask.